ربما من أكثر التطورات لفتا للنظر ما كتبه أحد أبرز الباحثين الأمريكيين، هو باحث في معهد واشنطن انستيتيوت، اسمه إريك تريجر. كتب النهاردة على موقع التواصل الاجتماعي تويتر، بيقول: محمد البلتاجي in charge of restructuring Egypt Interior Ministry to permit Muslim brother members to join. محمد البلتاجي يتولى إعادة هيكلة وزارة الداخلية في مصر للسماح لأعضاء جماعة الإخوان المسلمين من الانضمام إليها. هذه هي الترجمة الدقيقة على الهواء أمام حضراتكم. طبعا أثارت مداخلة كهذه لغطا كثيرا، ونقلت كثير من وسائل الإعلام هذا الأمر عن الباحث الأمريكي إريك تريجر. وإحنا كنا على اتصال مع السيد إريك تريجر، زملائي على اتصال به بالهاتف وأيضا بالإيميل بالبريد الإلكتروني لمحاولة استوضاح الحقيقة. قبل ذلك خلونا نشوف لما رجع، هو كان موجود في مصر الأسبوع اللي فات، ورجع على معهد واشنطن وقدم يعني عرض أمام أعضاء المدعوين في معهد واشنطن على نتائج رحلته في مصر. قعد يحلل الموقف كله من أوله إلى آخره. في سياق الأمر ده هو اتكلم عن الدكتور محمد البلتاجي، وكتب الكلام اللي لسه قاريه على حضراتكم من شوية. هعرض على حضراتكم المقطع من العرض اللي هو قدمه إريك تريجر، واتكلم فيه. كان أساسا بيتكلم عن الجيل الجديد من أسميه يونج جنريشن، ما بين قوسين يونج، اللي هو يعتبر الصف الثاني، اللي هو من رأيه أنه هيتولى دفة الأمور في مصر من خلال جماعة الإخوان المسلمين. ذكر تحديدا 3 أسماء: دكتور سعد الحسيني الذي هو الآن محافظ لكفر الشيخ، وأسامة ياسين، مهندس أسامة ياسين الذي هو وزير للشباب، والدكتور محمد البلتاجي. كما قال في هذا الفيديو، هو وجه سؤالا إلى الدكتور محمد البلتاجي، قال له: أنا ملاحظ أنه الدكتور الحسيني لأنه قريب من المهندس خيرت الشاطر بقى محافظ، وملاحظ أنه المهندس أسامة ياسين لأنه هو كان بيدير دفة الأمور في الميدان في بدايات الثورة، وأيام ما كان الدكتور محمد مرسي بيديرها من داخل مكتب الإرشاد، بقى وزير. أنت ولا حاجة. ده التعبير بالظبط اللي استخدمه. You are nothing. هنشوف، خلونا نكمل الكلام اللي هو بيقوله بنفسه، واحنا حاولنا نكون دقيقين في الترجمة بتاعته على الشاشة.
So I asked him point blank, I said, listen, there are 3 top young Muslim brothers who are up and coming. Saad al-Husseini is a governor, Osama Yassin is a minister, and you're nothing. Why are you nothing? Why were you passed over? And he gave me a look, which is fair because it was a really rude question. And then he said to me, well, actually, I'm the one in charge of trying to reform the Interior Ministry. What does that mean? That means that he's going to try to make sure that the Interior Ministry is more open, which is code word for saying, and he sort of admitted this, that he's going to try to drop the restrictions on Muslim brothers entering the Interior Ministry. So actually, despite the fact that he has not been given a real governmental executive position, you should watch him because he's going to be the one who will be trying to restructure the Interior Ministry. Remember, the Brotherhood's 3 enemies, as they see it within the government, are the judiciary, state media, Interior Ministry. That's the
إريك تريجر الباحث في معهد واشنطن، وهو يعرض نتائج زيارته البحثية إلى مصر الأسبوع الماضي، عرضها أمام أعضاء وزوار المعهد، وموجود الفيديو كاملا على موقع المعهد لمن يريد الرجوع إليه. نحن الذين ترجمنا بقدر استطاعتنا الأمر بشكل دقيق.
far, the Arab Spring hasn't turned out so well for many in the Middle East. Is the Middle East really doomed to an Islamist winter? Or is there something Middle Easterners, or we, can do to help prevent that outcome? Elliot?
If there's ever going to be a turn away from this, it's going to have to be in another free election where they lose, because I think the people are going to find, as they look for jobs, that, you know, Islam is not the answer. But if there's no election, they don't get to make another choice. So it's the rules of the game that we can help them maintain, partly through our aid, but more, I think, through moral and political support for the people in those countries, and there are many of them, who wish to avoid a permanent Islamist.
The problem this revolution did, they thought that this revolution would bring also wealth, and that they will be, that between day and night their life will change, and there will be prosperity. And of course it doesn't happen this way, you know. So the expectation has been taken very, very high, and the circumstances now are at their worst. So, and the Muslim Brotherhoods are actually clever in a way. They say, okay, if we don't take the government, how can you expect us to deliver? So we will be blamed by the population of failure while we don't have the means of execution. The army definitely doesn't want to cancel the treaty. The army definitely will never and never wants to go to war with Israel anymore. They actually have positive sentiments. And there is another fact that we can't afford to have a war with Israel because all our defense system is US based, and the US will never allow us to use it against Israel, you know. So that's, again, it's fictitious, you know, when we think that the Egyptian army will go and do that. But to answer your questions, even if they're saying today we will not cancel the treaty, we will not do that, their idea of the Islamic Khilafah includes Hamas. You know, the Murshid said, first the Murshid is the guy who said,
the supreme guide of the Brotherhood.
Yeah, the supreme guide said clearly, openly, our aim is to do finally the dream of the Islamic Khilafah. Okay, so maybe they want to turn Israel also into part of the Islamic Khilafah using Hamas or whatsoever, you know. So if you guys want to trust them, you know. But they'll give you all the nice words right now because they're not fully in power. Once they're in power, we're all in deep trouble.
I'm at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the Ira Weiner Fellow here, and I mean, I guess to deal with the question of how exactly the Arab Spring, and in particular the uprising in Egypt, has affected relations between Israel and Egypt, I guess the key thing to focus on is that Tahrir Square and the early stages of the revolt were not really about the United States, they weren't about Israel, they weren't about the treaty, they were really about overhauling a system of government which had become very objectionable to I wouldn't say most necessarily, but certainly many Egyptians who wanted a better future, felt that the current regime couldn't give it to them, saw an uprising in Tunisia and decided to follow suit. That uprising was really not led by Islamists, it was led by at first kind of youth activists who were mostly secular, although certainly some were Islamists, then followed by mostly middle-class Egyptians who broadly represented Egyptian society. What's happened since then is that you've had a parliamentary election that was won overwhelmingly by Islamists, 47% of the parliament now seated by the Muslim Brotherhood, roughly another 24% by Salafists, and that could have very serious consequences in a couple of ways. One of which is that both have said they want to put the Camp David Accords to a referendum, Now, how they would execute this and what kind of pushback they would get from the military, it really remains to be seen, and I guess that's what people are counting on in being hopeful that the treaty will stand, that the military will push back, or that some sort of deal will be arranged. But it's, you know, I'm not that optimistic because I think the future is really in the Islamists' favor. The second question is, you know, even if the treaty remains in some shape or form, what happens to the Sinai? The Sinai right now is a very unstable region being overrun by warring Bedouin tribes who are in some instances crossing the border into Israel trying to launch attacks. One of which was quite successful back in August. And really, it's the instability of the Sinai that could create a climate in which Cairo and Jerusalem have to confront one another. That's really what we saw in August after the attack, when Israel responded, accidentally killed Egyptian soldiers, and then Egypt, was caught in a very difficult diplomatic situation. Ultimately, it was resolved, but not before the Israeli embassy came under attack. But anyway, two things to really focus on here are, one, what the Islamists will do in power, and secondly, whether the instability in the Sinai will catalyze a crisis between the two countries.
Welcome to the Washington Institute. Again, if we could please all turn off our cell phones, because we are live streaming today's event. Over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, Institute staff members have fanned out throughout the Middle East, from Rabat to Dubai. And we've had people traveling to all corners of this region in order to return prior to President Obama's visit to the Middle East and inject some on-the-ground observations and insight into the deliberations inside Washington in the early weeks of this administration, and as the administration prepares for the president's visit. Today, I've invited 3 of our scholars who were throughout North Africa to offer their observations and impressions. And then on Thursday, we reconvened to focus on Syria and its regional repercussions and the impact that the regionals are having on the Syria issue. So if you haven't already RSVP'd for the Thursday event, please do so. Today, as I said, we're focusing on North Africa, and here the issues really are quite complex and different depending on where you stand in North Africa. Egypt, economic, political turmoil, security in the Sinai, security in Port Said, and the inability of the government to provide for basic security for its people.
I was in Egypt for a week, really a full week of work on the ground. I want to kind of describe the trip. So I went into this trip feeling as though the real story was not happening in Cairo. I mean, you've been reading about the clashes and the protests in Mansoura, in Port Said, the civil disobedience, and there have been reports of just attacks all over the country, particularly in the Delta and in the Suez Canal area. So, of course, I started in Cairo, but I then went to Alexandria, where I spent a couple of days. I went to Kafr el-Sheikh, which is a Delta governorate. The governor there is a Muslim brother. He's one of the 2 4 Muslim brother governors, but this guy was previously a guidance office member, so a very high-ranking Muslim brother. And then I went to Suez and then back to Cairo. Now, in each of these stops, I was not only meeting with national leaders from the various parties that matter, and I'll discuss those, but I was also really looking at the local level, the governorate level, and trying to figure out how people are preparing, how different parties are preparing for elections, the extent of the upheaval, and also the motivations for the boycott of the non-Islamists, for how the Muslim Brotherhood will organize, what's happening regarding splits within the Salafist bloc. So that's really what I'm going to be presenting today. Here's the short version of what I found. First of all, and I think this is a very important thing to focus on, the Muslim Brotherhood has power, but it has no control. And here I actually have to kind of correct myself, because I've been under the assumption for a while that, yes, the Brotherhood would win elections, and that they're a totalitarian organization that would then seek to implement power, but the fact is the Brotherhood can't actually do it. They cannot, they simply do not know how to govern. They do not know how to work within a bureaucracy. They don't know how to manage a bureaucracy. And the more they've tried to enforce their rule, the greater the resistance has been.